Hey, Lij.
Hey, Hamish, how are you, man?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing very well. It's mid-September, which may be dating when we do the interview here, but it's still like blisteringly hot outside in Nashville.
Yeah, I'm very glad to be in England sometimes.
Isn't it like cloudy and rainy every other day or something? And
Um,
don't you go around with an umbrella, a black umbrella, and a bowler hat?
I think that's probably Scotland, but then people in Scotland probably say that's Iceland or something. I don't know.
Okay, all right, good enough.
Um, so we were talking a little bit before that you've been in court recently. What can you tell a story a little bit about that and what you've been fighting for? Because it's kind of interesting recording thing.
Sure, yeah. So I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and Nashville, the city, is in a county called Davidson County, and there have been a long history of home studios happening in Nashville going all the way back to the 1950s. But of course, a big resurgence, maybe not resurgence, but a big introduction of home studios in starting in the 1990s with the introduction of things like ADATs and then Pro Tools and then computer recording, um, all the way to today, where we have what's familiar to all of us, this concept of like the home studio. You just have a computer and an interface and some mics, and you're ready to start going to work. But in Nashville, there's probably a couple of thousand home studios that are actually working and making records with people, and having an artist come over and record vocals and guitar and maybe a band or whatever, and making professional records, and have been for a long time. But it turns out that Davidson County actually has a city zoning ordinance that says if you're in a residence and you're in a home studio, that you're technically not allowed to have a customer come over to your house. And I didn't even know that, back when I bought my house. I'd just seen people have home studios, and I thought that looks great. That's what I want to do too. So fast forward to more recently, I bought my house back in 2000, but fast forward to more recently, and in 2015, 4 years ago, almost 5 years at this point, I got a cease and desist letter from the city of Nashville that said, "Hey, you're operating your studio as a commercial recording studio, and you're not allowed to do that. So we're going to shut you down." And it was pretty scary at the time. And they threatened to do things like first they said, "You ready to do an inspection?" I was like, "What do you mean?" They said, we'll come walk through and verify you've removed all recording equipment from the premises." And I was like, "Whoa, hold the bus, dude. What are you talking about? This is my home. I can't do that." And so they sort of backed off a little on that, but they said, "Listen, if we get another complaint about you recording anybody other than yourself in your studio, in your home studio, then we'll immediately take you to court and file a warrant." So that shut down my ability to have my website and be promoting the studio and trying to invite artists to come work with me. And I had to, they also had me shut down my YouTube channel. I had done like 100 videos over that year with bands coming into the studio and performing, and doing something called stereo sessions, which you could go check out if you want. It's called stereosessions.com. But we were just doing something that's familiar. You've seen it, with lots of studios. It's a great way to sort of build the community, the music community around you, and promote your studio. So they had made me shut that down too. And then I spoke to the press about it out of frustration, and ended up having an article in the local paper, front page article in the Tennessean. And then shortly after that, a couple of nonprofit legal firms reached out to me, and they said, "Hey, we think what you're going through is bullshit." Oh, I didn't ask you about my language.
Go for it. It's fine.
Okay, good. "We think what you're going through is BS, and we want to represent you with your case." And so I talked to both of them, and we decided to all team up together. And then more recently, in 2017, we actually tried to apply for a rezoning And then that almost made it through the city council, but it got voted down 20-14. So I was unable to just simply legally rezone it, my property, to allow me to live here and have a home studio. So we decided the next step was to file a lawsuit. So in December of 2017, we filed a lawsuit, and I actually have a co-plaintiff in the case, is a woman who, because remember, Nashville doesn't allow this across all home businesses. So like if you're a little old lady who wants to teach piano to kids in the neighborhood, not legal. If you want to, make essential oils and have people come over to your living room and show them your product and sell it, not allowed. If you want to build websites for people and have them come over to your website, to your studio and look at the website and work on it, or, you're taking wedding photographs and they're going to come over and you're just going to, pick and edit the best photographs. None of that's legal in Nashville, which is ridiculous. But my co-plaintiff is a woman who's a retired hairdresser, and she just simply wanted to support herself in her retirement, continuing to do hair for the same clients she'd been working with her whole life. And so we filed a lawsuit against the city, demonstrating, arguing that the city was actually infringing on our constitutional rights under the Tennessee Constitution to be allowed to make an honest living, working from our own homes, in privacy without bothering anybody. And that actually came to a more recent court hearing just this past week, where we were able to present our whole argument. The plaintiff side and also the defense side both presented to the judge for something called a summary judgment, which means that if all the facts are sort of indisputable and there's no need for an actual trial, then the judge should just be able to make a summary judgment based on all the evidence and the facts. So that's what happened last week, is we actually went in front of the judge for a summary judgment hearing, and now we wait patiently while the judge makes her decision over the next 30 days.
Are you optimistic about the decision?
I'm very optimistic about it. Yeah, I mean, the court case is incredibly strong. If you read the memo, which is on public record, I can even share it with you, and you can put a link in the show notes if you want.
Yeah, sure. But
it's my legal team has done an incredible job of presenting this argument. I was really blown away by it. And it just breaks down the issue into the core arguments that the city, Metro here in Nashville, makes for the reasons why it disallows home businesses, and home studios to exist as a place of work where you have a customer come over. And then they one by one refute every single one of those points and point out all the ways in which the city already allows all these things. So that's a big part of the argument is, remember, the limitation on this is that you can't have a customer come over to your home residence to record them in a home studio. And so, my legal team put together this argument, and they point out all these precedential cases that have already been approved here in Tennessee that allow for all these things to exist. And more recently, the really important ones to be aware of are things like daycares, which already exist. In fact, there's one right across the alley/street behind my studio, that will allow people to bring over children up to 12 customers every single day and drop them off and take care of them. And of course, that's a good thing. I mean, we need daycare, and, keeping it in the neighborhood where it sort of keeps the neighbors close is a real positive aspect, which is the same for something like a recording studio. And then the other big one is the short-term rental ordinance here in Nashville, which says that you're allowed to, using things like Airbnb or any of the other ones, you're allowed to rent a room in your house for one night, or multiple nights. And of course, there's always been long-term rental. You could rent to tenants for a month, 2 months, 6 months, 12 months. So residences have always been used for places of business as well. It's just that, most home studios, we live in our homes and we want to be able to use them as well to support ourselves.
Unless there's anything else you wanted to say about it, so maybe we could move on to talk a bit about your podcast.
Sure. Well, anyway, I'm very hopeful and should know more within the next month.
Great. So your podcast was actually one of the podcasts that inspired me to start my own. So I think it'll be interesting to hear a little bit about kind of how you got started and what drove you to start interviewing producers and engineers.
Sure. Well, ironically, I started my podcast right at the same time as I got shut down by the city for my studio. And that just sort of happened to time out that way. But I had been a big fan of listening to podcasts. I was kind of blown away. I remember the first time I ever discovered things like iTunes U, where you could just go listen to a lecture on some topic that you were interested in, and then started listening to, discovering and listening to podcasts actually about business. I mean, like for me at the time, I was running my studio and I wanted to learn more about how to operate as a business successfully. And so I, started absorbing all this information in the podcast world. And one of the messages I got, which was, pertinent to actually creating an online business, was the idea that you can actually take what you really love to do and create a podcast or create a channel on YouTube, or any of these kind of content creation areas around that and build and grow, kind of a new or a second additional business using that, which is, of course, exactly what you're doing, Hamish, with Somewhere Sound. It's a great way to create something that can, have a larger reach out into the world through the internet that's directly connected to what you do and love to do, making records. So I decided that I really wanted to do that. And, I realized that I already knew a lot of great people in the industry, and it would be a lot of fun to do interviews. And I had always enjoyed doing interviews. In fact, I had, even traveled around when I was younger doing field recording and recording spoken word and poetry and people's stories and music and stuff like that. So I really enjoyed that. And then I just realized I kind of put all the dots together, and I was like, oh, I should create a podcast where I interview other producers and engineers, and we get to talk about all the stuff we love talking about in the studio anyway, but really do it with the mission of helping everybody out with making their own records, in the same way that I'd sort of been locally doing that here at the studio by bringing in interns and enjoying going through the teaching process. So I launched the show in 2015 and with a few interviews ready to go. And I've been doing a weekly podcast ever since. And now we're, I think, over 225 episodes recorded or something like that. Some of them are still coming out, around the time that this interview may be out. But it's been a lot of fun, and we're about to cross 1 million downloads for the show. And, our around 30, 25 growing up to 30,000 downloads every single month. So it's really amazing to see the whole growth of the thing and to realize that, when you decide you want to start something, if you have a vision for it and you just do it and you follow through on it, it's probably going to work.
What's the growth been like over time? Did it kind of start off quite strong, or was it a big kind of upward curve, or were there certain guests that kind of boosted your general popularity?
Well, there have definitely been certain guests that have boosted popularity and gotten a lot more downloads and listens than others. And I find that often correlates with the people who are guests who also are very well known on the internet. So, if I have somebody on who is, has real fame in terms of, the great records they've done and stories, but maybe doesn't have much of a web presence, then it doesn't translate in the same way as somebody who's already very active on the internet and gets a lot of views. If you have a Vance Powell on the show, or Andrew Sheps, or even Steve Albini, who's a self-described podcast whore, he just loves to share all his knowledge and talk about making records, which is great for all of us, But those ones definitely create a spike in the shows. And, but when I launched the show, I had been kind of doing my homework about how to launch a podcast. And one of the key goals for me at the very beginning was to launch the show so that on iTunes in the first week, there's basically like a podcast finding, on iTunes, there's something called New and Noteworthy, where when you go look there, it'll show you, it'll basically bring the newest podcasts to the front. And so like, hey, meet all the newcomers, just to give you a chance to get noticed. And when I launched the show, I was really careful to make sure that I was getting enough reviews on the show and I was doing all the right stuff for rising in the ranks there. And I was able to hit number one in all three of my podcast categories during those first 8 weeks. So that was a lot. That really helped, and that was like, I remember jumping up and down and high-fiving my daughter one night because, I'd hit this milestone. And then immediately after that, it completely just dropped right off the map. As soon as the 8 weeks were over, all my downloads and listens just went poof, and they just plummeted like Bitcoin. And then for a long time, they just kind of slowly worked their way up. So then, that's kind of the nature of it. Sometimes with creating something new like that, whether it's a channel or even a business, you got to just keep consistent and it'll slowly grow. And then at some point you can, if you're lucky, you see something called a hockey stick growth, which means the line just kind of all of a sudden takes off and starts going up and you're like, whoa, this is great. So yeah, I can keep going on that, but that pretty much answers the question of starting it.
You definitely did more homework than I did.
Okay, good.
Were there any kind of guests at the start who were your like dream guests? Like I had 3 guests I really wanted to get and really want to get as a kind of goal at the very start. Did you have any particular ones in mind?
Well, I still have one, which is Rick Rubin,
right.
But I've heard that he just doesn't do interviews. So I think I'm going to have to meet him at the meditation center one day or something like that and ask him in person. But, having Steve Albini on was a big, exciting guest for me at the time. And I already knew him, so I felt confident about asking him. But for me, I felt like I wanted to wait until I knew what I was doing before I asked him. And that's an interesting topic too, because, here you are, Hamish, and you started your podcast. And like, one of the things that's truly amazing about what you do is you're like the opposite, where you're like, nobody needs to know anything. I'm just going to go straight for the very best guests and bring them on. And you've had an incredible list of guests on your podcast. And I know you got an incredible list coming up too. So congrats on that, man.
Thank you. It definitely was by accident.
I don't know about all that.
Well, yeah, I was going to say Steve Albini was one of my dream guests as well, and he was actually the very first person to say yes to the podcast. So I think without him, it would not have gone nearly as well.
Well, bringing Andrew Sheps on the show was really exciting for me too. He just gave such a great interview, and it was so jam-packed with knowledge and, so many tips and so much advice about the studio. And then Vance Powell too, when he came back on the show particularly, and we just focused on mixing, it was just like, let's put it this way. When you're listening, you better have a notepad ready.
Right.
And you better know where the pause button is and take a lot of notes because it's that much information.
Yeah, with my interview with Vance, I just watched a video that he'd done with Sound on Sound. So I literally had about 15 questions just about that video. So that's basically all we talked about.
Was that the mixing where he really breaks down the way he mics the drums and all that kind of stuff?
It was about recording a band in one room, I think is what it's called.
Yep.
And I had a lot of questions about his techniques in that video, so we actually talked about that for nearly the whole interview.
Yeah, it's pretty fun.
And yeah,
I started using those techniques too on my next session. So one of the tricks I picked up from him was like sticking a crunchy mic in with the drums and compressing the crap out of it and even distorting it a little bit. And then even running that through like a delay and blending that in with the drums to get kind of like a Zeppelin, effect. And so that sort of led me down the path of going like, well, if that sounded good, well, let me try some more, So then now I've got a couple of new favorite mics I like to include on each drum miking, one of which is the Dr. Alien Smith Dirt Mic 01, which has built-in distortion in a bullet mic. And I'll stick that right above the kick and by the snare shell. And then I could run that through like a delay. I've got a Echoplex tape delay, and also I'll kind of run it through that and blend that in with the drums. And then the other is what we call the butt mic. And we just took a bunch of dynamics and put them down on the floor underneath the drum stool. And then surprisingly, the one that we like the most is the same one you're using right now, which is the SM58, the Shure vintage SM58. And then I'll run that through my rack mount Sans amp, and then you can kind of dial in the frequencies and the bigness of the drums where you want it to blend with the rest of it. And just doing stuff like that is so much fun.
How well do you generally remember what you talk about in the interviews? Because I find that when I go back and edit it, it's like listening to it all for the first time, because I'm just completely goes over my head when I'm actually doing it.
Yeah, me too, big time. I mean, because when you're a host on an interview, you're trying to be very focused and engaged, but at the same time, it's like you're the pilot flying the plane. You're like, the hostess giving out all the drinks and the snacks at the same time. You're also the baggage claim, making sure everything gets there. So you've got all these questions in front of you, and you're looking at the timer. You're hoping that the recorder doesn't drop out of record, and all that stuff's really distracting. And then for me, it's actually not until I actually go back and listen to the finished episode when I'm driving in the car that it all just hits me.
Have there been things that you've learned in interviews that you were saying that thing with Vance, those mics? Have there been anything else that's really stuck with you and you kind of use on a lot of sessions?
Yeah, definitely miking the drums was a big one from Vance. He also talked about doing a special miking on the guitar amp that was like 4 different mics. So he was miking an amp, and I think it was like a Princeton Reverb, something like that. And he put a U67 and a 57 on one side of the cone. And then on the other side of the cone, these are both on the edges of the cone. The other side was like a Royer ribbon and an RCA BK5. And afterwards I was like, shit, I got all those mics. I need to try that. I guess I could have just stopped it. I've got all those mics. That's enough to celebrate right there.
Yeah.
But actually having them and realizing I was getting ready to record my record and I could try that on recording my guitar. And so I ended up doing that, and it sounds killer. It was pretty complex guitar miking. It was like 4 mics on the guitar. I ran them all through my console. Then I took the output of my console, ran that through a stereo compressor. Then I simultaneously took all those mics in mono and blended them through the 1176 and brought that up the middle. So I ended up with like a stereo track and a mono track for my guitar sound. But it really did sound good. So that was kind of fun to do. And then, some of the takeaways from Andrew Sheps, I don't remember whether I learned this on the podcast or whether I watched this in another video he did. Maybe it was on Pure Mix. Yeah, but it was using what's called the back bus to mix with. Oh, and I'm pretty sure I saw a video that Graham Cochran did years ago where he, came back from NAMM and shared that with everybody. And it's such a great trick for mixing where you just take different approaches, but you basically don't include the drums in this. So the drums get their own sound, but then everything else, and maybe you do or don't include the vocals in it. I think I do include the vocals because I seem to remember that's what Andrew said to do. But you take everything and you simultaneously run it through an additional bus, same mix, and then this bus goes through an 1176, and you could just choose the plugin choice that works for you. And then you blend that back into the final mix. So you've got all your instruments and your vocals. They're all feeding the final mix, but they're also simultaneously feeding this back bus mix. And then you take the 1176 on that, and you get like maybe a couple dB of movement on the needle, something like that. Not too crazy, but enough to be compressing. And the idea is that with a compressor, when the vocals sing, it kind of pushes the instruments back, and when the vocal rests, the instruments come forward again. And you blend that into the mix, and it just does an incredible effect of taking the entire mix that you've already been building, and it just sort of takes one step closer. That's the best way I could describe it. And then there was another one that came from Craig Alvin, which was one of my early guests on the show. And he had something that was called the like everything but the bass boss. And it was the same kind of concept, but I think he mixed on a console a lot. I think he's still mixing on a console. But one of the challenges, even if you're mixing in the box, is that you have this kind of mix bus setup, and you're mixing, and then you get to the louder section, you're trying to push it a little bit more, or you're like, crap, I can't hear the kick drum and the bass anymore. I need to bring those up for this outro section. But when you try to bring those up, everything just starts collapsing in your sound, and it gets mushy or whatever, and you're like, ah. So his trick was take everything but the bass and route it to its own OGS mix. And the bass, you kind of start out at the loudest section of the song, and you get your drums and your bass to just sound awesome. Where you're like, that sounds great. I love that. I hope I don't screw it up. And then you mix, and inevitably you screw it up when you get to the big loud section. And then at that point, what you do is you take your everything but the bass fader, and you pull it all the way down so that your bass sounds killer again, whatever, bass and drums or bass and kick or whatever. And then you start raising up that the everything but the bass fader again to just underneath where you were. And it's like you've kind of restructured your whole mix so that now, that the mix stuff makes sense, but it's no longer, you're not having to bring up the bass into the final output stage, Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. All these techniques are far more than I usually do.
Yeah, and these are for mixes with lots of routing, and you're trying all kinds of cool stuff. And, in my world, that usually translates into I'm doing a rock mix or something that's, some big loud power band. Because a big part of that is just the fact that we, create records in multi-track stages with lots of overdubs. So we've already sort of dissected all the music into these little bits and parts, and now we have to bring them all back together. And there's no longer a natural room that all this sound is getting brought back together in. So we're having to recreate that. And then, we want to end up with a mix where there's just the right amount of power happening in all these different section changes. And so that's why it becomes so much work. You have to be very attentive to every single dynamic change and every single section change such that, you've reconstructed the just right amount of power for everything in that moment. And, it's one of the reasons also why if you can just record a band in a room playing together and get it to sound great like that, it takes a whole lot of work off your plate because they're going to make it sound great in the room, and that's all you have to do is capture it.
Yeah, well, that's definitely my general thing is recording bands live in the rooms. That's maybe why I haven't had to delve into very complicated different mixing techniques like those.
Yeah, well, you'll save yourself a lot of time, and you'll save your band a lot of money.
Yeah, I hope so.
And they'll keep coming back because they'll go off and write the next best record and come record it with you again while we're still working on the first one.
Yeah, when they come back and say, "I'm so glad that we didn't have to do it track by track in a tiny little cupboard." Is what they usually say. But
yeah, good call.
What were some of the more difficult guests to think of questions for? Because I've certainly had guests again, kind of unexpectedly, almost the most famous guests are the hardest to think of questions for because they've really been asked everything already. Have there been any in memory that have been the most difficult for you?
George Massenburg was challenging because we had to do it sort of on a Sunday morning. So it was sort of like, kind of challenging to just figure out when to do it. And then it's surprising, like the more famous the guest, the more likely they are to show up with like the worst interview mic imaginable. and the other part of the irony is, the better engineer they are and the more that likely they are to know how to get an amazing recording of something, the less likely they are to have a simple USB mic around that you just plug into the computer and it talks to, Skype or whatever tool you're using for recording an over the internet interview. So, that's some of the stuff I found. But there was another twist to it too. So, for example, when I first had Steve Albini onto the show, he showed up with, taking the interview in his office. Probably doors were wide open, phones were ringing, and it was just through a computer, and he was just using the built-in computer mic and the speaker on it, and he didn't have headphones on. So it was by definition the worst possible tool you could use to conduct a Skype interview for reasons like it doesn't sound very good. There's, for him to hear me, it's my voice coming out of a little computer speaker. It also causes more like crosstalk and bleed in Skype, the way it records it, or like it causes you to talk over each other and interrupt each other. But because he was such a good guest and because he had such awesome things to say, it was still one of the most downloaded episodes that I had. So go figure.
I found something similar with the best recording engineers have the worst interview mics. However, the one exception is Butch Vig. He used a U47 for the interview. And that's by far the most effort I've had someone put in.
Right on. Yeah, I remember when I had Chris James on the show, he really went to, he sort of like doubled over backwards to try and get a really great sounding U87 set up in an ISO booth and everything like that. It was sort of funny. I mean, like, it almost was too much at first, and we finally arrived at just the just right sound. But it was like, I find that if you actually want to do, good sound over the internet, either set up a great mic and go through an interface, or just get like a USB mic and just plug it in. Because a lot of times doing these kind of interviews, it has more to do with the fact of mic placement than it does, just how fancy the mic is.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why my podcast isn't that kind of conversational, or a lot of the episodes aren't, is again, like you were saying, like it's very difficult to talk quickly with someone else because it just ends up talking over each other so easily.
Yeah, indeed. And then sometimes I have guests on and you just don't know what their sort of meter and style is, or tempo of talking. And some guests will just keep going and they'll not really leave a space and they'll just keep going. And you're trying to interject something. And I've gotten beat up, completely on YouTube comments by listeners who's like, this host needs to learn how to shut up, Yeah. And it's funny because at first you see that and you're like, oh man, that really hurts my feelings. And then immediately you're like, but it's really a good suggestion. So I'm gonna take time out to learn how to be a better interviewer and not interrupt my guest if I can.
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about how I use a handheld mic, and that's actually partly so I can do it through just put it down while they're talking, so I don't have any urge to interrupt unless it's like a really clear gap. I think definitely if you listen to like the first interviews I was doing, I edit myself out, when they're talking completely. But the first interviews, there's like a few interruptions, or kind of me trying to start a next question before I realized that you just literally can't. You can't.
Right, yeah, totally.
You have to wait for a very clear gap to talk at all.
Please leave me a very clear gap.
Yeah.
It's sort of the same with the band, it's like, guys, leave me a very clear ending to the song before I press stop and record.
We need to do like a walkie-talkie thing where they say over at the end of them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, there's been challenges, various ones. I recently had a challenge that, oh boy, I've had, this hasn't happened in a long time, but I had the technology that I used to record the interview failed. And I was just like, are you kidding me? And it's computer stuff, It's like it had worked flawlessly for years, and then all of a sudden, one day it just doesn't record the both voices, and you're like, what happened? So, but I mean, that's a little bit. I mean, we really strive as engineers to be perfect and thorough, and never ever not record or not capture the performance. But I do think sometimes you have to recognize that there's a statistic to it too. So like, if you capture perfectly 99 performances and you don't capture one, you usually all you can think about is the one you didn't capture. But do remember every once in a while that you did successfully capture 99 of them, and that's worth something,
Yeah, and it's a learning experience for the future and how to make it not go wrong. So hopefully it'll go wrong even less times in future.
Indeed. Make sure it's a learning experience so that you're improving.
I get told quite a lot that I'm incredibly calm, like during sessions. The only thing that really stresses me out during sessions is equipment failing, because it's just,
Yeah,
it kind of feels helpless, and you just have to. Yeah, it can be pretty excruciating.
helpless.
Well, helpless apart from restarting it 4 times and.
Yeah, I mean, I've had so many of those in the studio. I mean, if let's be honest, if you're a Pro Tools user, you're used to it. But like, there's just, and of course, that may not be fair 100% because other apps give other people other challenges, and that's certainly the one that I've used in the studio for nearly 30 years now. And there's just always something that will go wrong in the studio. So what I've learned is that it's less about blaming. You don't want to blame the tools, although you do want to when they deserve blaming, and you do want to choose the right tools. But the real answer to not having failures in the studio isn't to not have failures. It's to know how to work around those failures, so that the session itself doesn't fail. And like, the biggest skill that you're going to have as an engineer or as a producer, even musically, is the workaround. It's like, how do you not let this obstacle be an obstacle? You just go around it and keep moving.
I think one of the kind of best things about, or kind of from a session point of view, about recording becoming kind of so, like, lots of people know a little bit about recording, is that if something does go wrong, people quite often kind of understand they're not like, they can see when it's not your fault clearly, and they kind of feel sorry for you more than the fact that they like are annoyed that it takes them 5 more minutes to record their acoustic guitar take or something.
Right. You mean like they would rather that you're getting it right?
No, I just mean that like say for example that like your computer crashes or something. Like, I guess people, from my experience, are generally like, they don't, especially younger people who have experience with like recording on computers, is that they know it's not your fault, and they kind of feel sorry for you rather than want to have a go at you about it.
Yeah, I mean, I've had clients where they look at the computer crashing as like, like to like start questioning everything. It's like, is it broken? You're not going to charge me for this kind of thing.
Right.
And that stuff is really frustrating because it actually derails you. Like, as an engineer, you're already so maxed out trying to get everything to function that when, a client or the artist that you're working with is throwing, more, pulling the rug outness at you by sort of like casting you into doubt, that just really, it makes it difficult for you to stay focused on solving the problem.
Yeah, I'd say so. And luckily, I haven't had too many problems with that sort of thing. Because I mean, I guess at least if you, it was really helpful when the artist trusts you enough to know that you're doing your
Yeah.
best, and your best isn't subpar. It's just it's very
It's
helpful
just that you're trying to do a difficult thing together.
exactly. And I think that the together part of it is helpful, and like this is something that we're working on together, and so like it's a group process, and it's not like a blaming people thing. It's a kind of help each other and feel sorry for each other thing.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there are expectations that are reasonable
Yeah,
to
of
have
course,
around a recording session for sure. But it's good to work with people that understand that, like, I mean, if you were like, I don't know why I'm making pilot airplane references, but if, let's say you were the rocket ship pilot that was going to take us on the first trip to Mars, be like, I'd probably be pretty amazed that you got us there, as opposed to like, yo, where was the ice in my mixed drink on this flight,
Yeah, exactly.
But as engineers, we want to both get them there and get them back and serve them the best drink they ever had.
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously, if you go to a session and all the microphones are broken and nothing's working, then obviously that is on the engineer. And, if you haven't had experience with them before, you can maybe say, okay, this wasn't a professional thing and we shouldn't have, they didn't deserve us to pay for it. But, if you've worked with that producer 20 times and it's been perfect, and then the one time all their stuff goes down, it's not the producer's, lack of attention. It's just unfortunate.
Yeah, totally. And like I said, stuff will happen. It does happen. It's just about not letting it derail the process. But the other thing is, in my experience, and I think it's pretty consistent for most people I know, is the loudest complainers are the ones who also want the most for the cheapest rate. And so when you work with people that are like, trying to get you to cut your rates and give you the cheapest thing all the time, they'll knock it down. They'll ask for, the super bargain basement rate for a session, and then complain that the mics didn't work. Not realizing that that's what you get for the bargain basement price. So, it's always just like a balancing act. But a good takeaway is just for us to remember that, it's always good to set your sights high and work with people that are professional themselves, because they're going to be the most understanding and the most appreciative of the hard work that you're putting in.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that cut price thing, because I used to do, before I set up my kind of studio business properly, I used to just kind of mix people's home recordings and things like that, just like anonymously, like people online sending the files over, and they were always by far the most difficult, like had the most problems with things, had the most like problems with mixes and stuff like that, compared to stuff now, which I'm getting paid a lot more for. But there's not any of these problems with. I mean, I think it's partly because if it's stuff people have recorded at home themselves, they expect you to make it sound like, the Beatles or something. In reality, you can't get someone's home recordings to sound like the Beatles, and then they blame you for that.
Yeah, right. I blame myself for that already.
Right.
That's what we do as engineers, right? We just blame ourselves for, like, no matter how good the work is we do, we blame ourselves for not doing better.
Yeah, I'd say so. It's a complicated world.
Yeah, but I sort of have a take on that. I realize that that's a natural artistic perspective to have, and it is the very thing that drives us to be better artists and better, craftsmen, is because we always look at the last thing we did as not good enough. It gives us the motivation to try and improve it. And over time, of course, there's a huge difference between the first stuff we do and the more recent stuff and the last stuff we do. And then you get into the whole conversation, that Ira Glass was famous for his quote, with This American Life, where he talks about, it's the creation of a body of work where you really see the vast improvement from beginning to end.
I think Steve Albini's actually been like the most helpful for me in terms of stuff like that, because he's been doing it for so long. He's so kind of firm-footed about what should be expected and stuff like that. Like he was saying with the Nirvana mixes, like when they had to get someone else to mix it, or wanted him to remix it, his view was, I'm going to listen back to it. If I feel like I've done the best job I can do, I'm not going to do anything else to it, and you can do what you want with it because you're the band. But if I feel like I've done a bad job, then be very happy to do more. But if I feel like I've done my best, then I stand by that. And I think that's been helpful for me, especially when dealing with, because I think every producer engineer comes up with people like that who, like, maybe they aren't happy with some element of it, or they want to take it somewhere else, and you kind of have to, obviously it's kind of upsetting sometimes, but you kind of have to say, I trust myself and this is the best I can do, so do what you want with it.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it helps too, because at some point you have to send the mix to the band, Yeah. And that is something that Andrew Sheps shared on the podcast with me, which I can recount right now, is this idea that when you're about, so you do the work on the mix, you get it to the place where you're like, this is the best I can do. And then you start writing an email to the band and you say, here's mix such and such. I did this thing to it. I got it to sound pretty good. I mean, we could, I struggled with this, or this thing happened, or, here's the things to maybe not, that I didn't really get to yet. And then he said, and then he doesn't hit send on that email. Then he looks at it. He looks at his list of excuses that accompany the mix. And then he goes back and one by one, he just addresses each of those excuses until he's taken care of them. And then he sends the mix over. And I started, paying attention to that. And I was like, it's so true. Think about how many times you're trying to take care of something, cross it off your to-do list, send it, get it off your plate, send it away. And then you're making excuses for it. And then if you just pause in that moment and you think, okay, I know I need to be done with this. I know I've got to move on to the next thing. But if I just went and dealt with each of these excuses right now, and then go do it and then send it, it's like, I just made this a whole lot better.
Yeah, I think that's actually been the most useful quote for me in all of doing this work. Because I think when I did your podcast, you asked me about my favorite recording quote or something, and I think I kind of said that in a slightly different way, that you shouldn't send a mix if you have to send it with excuses thing. It's been incredibly helpful for me. Like, if you can't send a mix an email with no text about it or whatever, then it's not ready.
Yeah, exactly. So that was a good takeaway for that. I don't know, man. If I think of more, maybe I'll think of more, lessons learned from guests on the show. There's certainly been a lot.
Yeah, I remember you asked me about that, and again, I just couldn't remember.
Oh, here's a good one. This is one of my favorites. This came from Jamie Tate, and it was about miking up an electric guitar. Because obviously there are other instruments where you can go out and listen to what the amp sounds like and decide that you think the guitar itself sounds good before you mic it. That's fine. And then there are some instruments like an acoustic guitar where you can put on headphones and move the mic around until you like the sound of the acoustic in the headphones. And that seems pretty easy to do. Drums are a little trickier, the drums are really loud and you move the mic around. You kind of have to have somebody else move the mic and see what it sounds like in the control room. But electric guitar was always, for me, a little bit like I kind of understood that you could move the mic around and it would sound different in different spots. You could angle the mic. You could go forward and backward. And that was helpful for me as far as dialing in the proximity effect. Like if the mic was too close to the amp and it was too muddy, woofy sounding, I could back it off a little bit, and it opened it up and, and kind of controlled the low end a little more. But other than that, like this concept that there are all these different places you can put the mic on the cone and each of them sound different, it's pretty overwhelming. I remember reading a article from you might have to put in a marker here, from Mixer Man. Thank you. There you go. Yeah. Sorry, I just had to conjure up his name. From Mixer Man, where he was talking about mic and a guitar amp, and you've got to have an assistant out there. This is way back when he would kind of do his rants and writing. And you got to have an assistant out there who's moving the mic every little increment, 1,000 times around the cone or something. And I was like, that's overwhelming. So Jamie had this great suggestion where he was like, here's the quick, simple tip for getting a great guitar sound. You just go out to the amp. You make sure the amp's on so that it's, buzzing or hissing or humming or whatever. Unplug the guitar for a moment, or have the guitar player promise not to play, so that all you hear is the hiss coming out of the amp. And then it's safe to just put your ear up in the mic position and move around on the amp cone until you hear a spot where you're like, that sounds good to me. Like, I like the tone coming out right there. It seems like it's a nice balance of the highs and lows and whatever. And then just take your mic and or take your finger, hold it in that spot, back away, and put the mic where your finger was. And that's a great starting place for a guitar sound. So I started doing that, and sure enough, I've just like nailed it every time. It's just, it always sounds good to me. And I'm like, that sounds great. I might move it forward or back a little for proximity. And if I really hate it, I might just move it somewhere else. But mostly that just gives you the sound you're hoping to get.
Great. So as you're talking about that.
For a close mic. Mic.
Well, as you're talking about that, maybe we can get in some of my kind of usual gear questions.
Let's do it.
What are some of your favorite electric guitar mics?
57's always a go-to mic. I have an RCA 74 Junior that I like a lot. I've got a pair of them here. One seems to have a deeper sound and the other one's thinner, so we call them fatty and skinny. So I'll use fatty along with the 57. I love that. When I did that guitar miking that I was describing with the U67 and a 57, and I don't have a Royer mic, but I have a B&O mic that has a Royer ribbon in it and a Royer transformer. So it's the closest thing I got. I'll put that up with the BK5, and that sounded really amazing. And then, I like doing direct guitars sometimes, actually. I just got in a thing I'm just checking out right now from IK Multimedia called the Axe.io. And it's just an interface that kind of has, I think it's called the Z-Tone section for impedance matching if you plug your guitar in. And then it uses their Amplitude 4 simulator. And that was sounding pretty cool in the headphones. I haven't used it on session yet, so I'll see if it becomes a favorite. But I'm sort of excited to experiment with that. And then I want to start adopting a technique that is advice I've gotten from a number of guests, and I heard about Warren Hewitt using on his sessions too, where you automatically run a guitar through a DI on the way to the amp so that you are capturing a raw DI sound and can kind of retreat that with a simulator later on. And then I think that could be really useful when you're getting a great guitar amp sound, but you want to try using an amp sim to create more of a wider effect around that guitar or something unusual. So yeah, those are, I don't know, that's probably more than you needed for the answer.
No, go. I'm happy to please ramble on about as many techniques you like.
But I think for me, I put guitar amps in the ISO room a lot, and then the drums are in the live room, which I call the gallery. I call the ISO room the phone booth. That's all because Steve Albini has cool names for his rooms. And I was like, I can't just call it the big room and the dead room and the small room. So I'm sort of more excited about getting the guitars out of that space. And the next territory I really want to explore is, backing the mic away from the guitar amp and miking the guitar amp from not up in the grill, up in its business. I want to back the mic away. And for that, I think, like the 67 or, more of a large diaphragm condenser make a really good choice.
Yeah, definitely. So obviously we've all seen photos like the Beatles recording like that. Whenever I've tried recording with a condensed microphone a few feet away, it just sounds like thin and kind of slightly off. So I
Right.
definitely want to experiment with that as well.
Right. Totally. Yeah. I never had so much luck trying to back it away. I had more luck getting up close to the grill. So I think it means just making sure you're recording the guitar in the right space, so you can back off a little bit. And then sometimes I'm really surprised. Sometimes I find that the better choice for the guitar sound is the crappy one that I never would have recognized as being the right choice for the guitar sound in the final mix. We ought to sort of automatically want to choose the ultimate sound for each sound as we're about to record it. And that's not at all what you need. What you need is an ultimate mix. And the ultimate mix means that something needs to be in the foreground and something needs to be in the background and something needs to be in the low frequencies and something needs to be in the high frequencies. And when you're trying to get the ultimate sound for each sound as you record it, it's the same thing as sort of soloing, mixing in solo mode. You end up with everything sounding like it's taking up all the space too much,
Yeah, definitely. And again, I think like everyone, it kind of blows my mind how little Steve Albini does processing wise to different stuff. And again, it's like he doesn't sit around and listen to everything in isolation. He just listens to everything together, and if there's a problem, he fixes it. But
yeah, I remember Steve Janowick told me that that's how Al Schmidt works too.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something to be said for him not being Steely Dan in that way.
Yeah, indeed. But being Steely Dan is cool too.
Yeah, I have interviewed several of Steely Dan's engineers, so I probably shouldn't say that.
Hey, Steely Dan has long been a reference for a great sounding record, and for good reason. And sure enough, because of that, some people, take the opposite stance. But they really are great sounding records.
Yeah, definitely.
Good way to test out, the sound of your monitors in your room too. But music is so vast and it's so based on taste, and that's the beauty of it. I mean, we're not trying to make, I don't know, what's a good quote here? We're not trying to make the correct music. We're just trying to make the music that we want to make.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think two good examples and kind of opposite ends of the spectrum would be like Steely Dan and then Exile on Main Street. Like two incredible sounding albums, but potentially the most opposite in terms of attention to each sound and clarity and everything.
Definitely. And then the Beatles records, of course, sound so perfect and unique, and they sound amazing. And then sometimes you listen to it and you're like, it's funny how your memory can play tricks on you too, which is why it's so important to reference things. Our memory can conjure up an image in our heads of what a great sound is and guide us down a complete, garden path in the studio where we get lost, trying to get whatever we're working on to sound just right. And then you go reference the original again. And you're like, oh man, it doesn't sound anything like that.
Yeah, definitely. I interviewed Ken Scott recently, and I couldn't pin him down about any particular techniques or anything, because he was saying just it varies so much. And it was never like, this is how he did it. This is, it was always,
yeah.
I can't remember what we did because he changed it every single day.
Yeah, that's why, again, that takeaway of remembering that when those guys were recording the Beatles records, for example, or Exile on Main Street, or Steely Dan, they all probably thought it sucked when they finished and were like, we'll get it right next time, And I mean, not necessarily overtly. I mean, they probably were pretty proud of what they did at the same time. But I wouldn't be surprised if they had that sense of like, I felt like I could have done better. Because that's built into what we do, and that's what keeps us pursuing greatness in sound and art. And it's that pursuit of sound that creates all this variety of amazing sounding records. Like there is no right answer. There's only the pursuit of the right answer. That's all that matters.
It's always amazing when kind of older engineers are still enthusiastic and still learning and still using new gear.
Yeah. A lot of fun stuff out there. Plus, there's so much more gear now than there ever was in the past.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's amazing to see someone like Al Schmidt using so many modern microphones and kind of such a varied range of stuff in terms of eras.
Yeah, indeed. Well, and then he's doing all those big band recordings and orchestral stuff and just so much. There's probably a lot of opportunity to try a lot of things.
Yeah, I'm sure. So, maybe moving on to bass. So, favorite mics, physicians?
So bass, let's see. I have a Avalon U5 DI that I use for bass a lot. It's my only, best DI in the studio, so that's the one I use. I would love to have like a red DI or some alternate tube ones. I just don't have those yet. Or Spectra 1964. I know they're making some incredible stuff for that. So I find that getting a good DI sound on a bass is crucial for electric bass. I think it's very important because there's certainly a chance that that's the one you're going to be leaning on in the mix to get things right. So it's great to have a good starting point. As far as an amp goes, if you've got a great sounding bass amp, sort of like the guitar amps, a lot of times those can get stuck in ISO booths, which is maybe not the right place for it. Because with low end, you really need to let it breathe. So you kind of need a big room for a bass amp to really speak and to be able to get the right sound coming out of the amp so that you can record it. But a lot of times that room is sort of already spoken for by the drums and, whatever else is going on. So if you can, put your big bass amp out in a big room so that it can open up and breathe. The low end can breathe. And then I've had great luck with I've tried a lot of everything on bass, but a lot of times I'll reach for my EV RE20 here. I kind of like the way that sounds on a bass amp. Sometimes I'll put up a 57 if that's the sound that I'm needing to add to the DI sound. As far as DI goes, I also have a Marshall JMP1. It's a tube direct recording interface for guitar and bass, and that sounds great. That's a great way to sort of dial in the right distortion on a bass, but still have the big focus and low end that's sometimes challenging to get out of an amp. But I also recently had a lot of luck using my my MicTech CV3 tube mic. It's a large diaphragm condenser. That really sounded great recording the bass amp. And then, of course, the AKG 414. I've got one of the BULSs here, and I love using that, adding that in with the 57 for either guitar or bass. It just seems to have a nice, it's like you get the condenser, wide frequency range and bigness, but it doesn't quite have too much top end because a lot of times I don't like too much. It's safer to have a lot of top end on a bass mic than on a guitar amp mic. Where it can sound fizzy and sizzly and kind of, you get too many bothersome frequencies. I'm trying to think of what else. SM7 sometimes sounds cool on a bass amp. But really it's more about the style of mic, I find. Like a large diaphragm tube mic, I think of those as having plenty of pillowy low end because you get sort of more harmonic content down there. So if that's the sound you're looking for, those can be good choices. A solid state large diaphragm condenser can be a great choice if you want more of a transparent low end and high end, and you really want to hear lots of upper clarity in what you're doing. And then again, I might back that mic away from the amp and not have it sort of eating the grill of the, when I record bass, it's like a 115 speaker cabinet. And then the dynamics are great for when you want to get up in the grill more and you're trying to get more sort of like skronkiness and rock and roll and more of that mid-range attitude out of a bass. But then you'll of course be presented with the challenge of, is the phasing and timing of the DI to the mic on the amp, are those things sort of fighting each other, or are they working together? And then you get into tools like, all right, so do we want to use a Little Labs IBP on the direct signal of the bass and sort of like dial that phase relationship back in time to match up with the mics? Or can we just use the time adjuster plugin in Pro Tools, for example, and time delay the DI a little bit? And for me, if I'm going to do the time delay trick and try and delay it, I start by zooming into the waveforms in Pro Tools. I'll record just a little bit of bass and see if I can measure the delay, the distance and samples between the DI happening and the mic happening, and then just delay the DI in time a little bit so that it's theoretically matched up now with the mic. And then, the amount of that would basically be a good rule of thumb is a foot equals a microsecond of delay, and or a millisecond, excuse me. 1 foot equals 1 millisecond of delay, and 1 millisecond is going to be, a thousandth of whatever your sample rate is.
Right.
So I guess if you're 44.1, that would be, 44 samples would be the delay time if your mic was a foot away from the amp. I guess that's a way to think of it. And if you're at 48, it'd be 48. And if you're at, 96, it'd be 96 samples.
What are some of your favorite compressors for bass? Because I found that varies a lot person by person.
I love the sound of the kind of the bigger tube compressors on bass when you're trying to get the warm finger bass, sound. Here in the studio, I'm looking at my Tiegler audio manufacturer of the Veritube recording channel, and that one's great for recording bass. I can plug it in direct, or I can run the mic through it. I also have, if you've got like, what's the one I'm thinking of? What's the blue one from? Is it from Sweden? I don't have it here. Yeah, TubeTech, thanks. The TubeTech is the C1 or something like that.
CL1B.
Those. Yeah, the CL1B. I remember those being fantastic. I just don't get to use it very often.
Also, to clarify for any angry listeners, it's from Denmark, not Sweden.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I knew it was from up where the sun sometimes doesn't rise or doesn't set.
Just don't want to anger the Scandinavian listeners.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. I love the Scandinavian listeners. So you guys have been wonderful fans of the podcast too. But another one would, of course, would be an LA2A. That'd be a great choice for bass. But I have a 1176 in here, and I really like that. If I'm going to put close mics on the bass, if I'm doing a rock bass, I'll put close mics on the speaker, maybe blend them together through the console, and then in mono, run it through the 1176 and add that to my direct sound. Maybe also, I kind of enjoy splitting out the bass so that I can really like dial in some different sounds. But, I might do the direct through the Avalon U5 going straight to Pro Tools. I might also split that and go to the Marshall JMP1 rack unit and dial in a cool bass sound there. I might also split the direct and go to the SansAmp rack mount that I have and dial in a great sound there. And usually those are places where I'm looking for a little bit of fuzz, and a little bit of sort of round upper bass sound. And then I'll also go out to the amp and I'll multi-mic it and run it in through the console and hit the 1176 and get a really in-your-face sort of natural, real rock bass tone. And that's really good for, putting a pick on the bass and recording that way.
Maybe moving on to drums, what have become some of your kind of favorite techniques, go-to mics, that sort of thing?
I've been really stuck on the AKG D112 for kick, and I typically put that inside the drum, inside the shell, so it's really getting a clear, punchy, controllable sound with the beater, and a nice low end, a nice punchy low end, and then I'll put a large diaphragm out in front of the kick, and I may leave the front head resonating. I may like lean a little. I call it like grandma's couch pillow. I've still got the old couch cushions. Don't throw those away. Those are gold in the studio. Couch cushions, old towels, and old sheets are great for drum recording. Keep them around the studio. But you can like lean the pillow up against the head slightly to just sort of tighten and deaden the sound and control the sustain of the kick if you want to. And then, a go-to pair for the snare drum for me would be a Shure SM57 on top and bottom. And then sometimes I try other ones. I've got an Altec. I don't even remember the model number. It's like a M20 or something like that. Although I think that's the tube lipstick mic that I have. Sometimes I like that on top. Whatever you put on the snare has got to be a mic that can really handle a lot of transient. But sometimes the condenser mics are great for snare too. You can get amazing sounds. In fact, we were talking about Tone Lux before this, and the old Sony C37 mics. That can be an incredible snare sound if you put that above the snare. I think it depends on how hard you're hitting it too. And sometimes I like to vary out the mic underneath the snare, so it's not 257s, but maybe it's a 57 on top, and maybe it's something else underneath the snare. And then I'll try, usually it's some of my other dynamic mics, like I have the EV RE16 and RE10. I'll try those out, or I'll try you can try a 58 or one of the Shure Beta mics. I just like to experiment. I swap them out really quickly and see if one sort of leaps out at you, because you often never know what to expect. But if you don't want to, take up time doing that, then, pair of 57s, you're going to be golden. For the toms, I clip on dynamic mics most of the time. I have the Mic Tech clip-on dynamic tom mics, and then I also have Lewitt clip-on dynamic tom mics, and those both sound great. And I go back and forth between those. And for my overheads, I've been using the Mic Tech CV3 tube large diaphragm condensers regularly, because I love the way they sound on the drums. They consistently give me a great drum sound. And if I want to do something a little different, the Coles 4038 is a fantastic choice for above the drums. If you want it mono or even in stereo, you can get more of like a, crunchy, just ribbon gives you a different kind of thing. It can take to compression really well. You can get a little bit more mid-range out of your drums as you compress it. Not quite so much sizzly top end, so it can help control the cymbals. And then small diaphragms in like an ORTF above the drums can be really cool to give you a little bit more of just cymbal and not try and capture the shells of the drums. So there's just so many variations. And then I've been using the Roswell Pro Audio Mini K47s as a stereo pair above the loft, looking down on the drums below, which is, it's kind of the gallery space. The big room here in the studio is, the big room is down below, but then there's a loft up above, so that's where the room mics can go. And those sound great, too.
Great. Maybe moving on to acoustic guitar. What are some of your favorite mics techniques?
Mic Tech C5 is a great acoustic guitar mic. I've loved using my U67, Neumann U67. It's a vintage one. Probably one of my favorite mics right now is the Roswell Pro Audio Delphos. I love that one for acoustic guitars. Just has a gorgeous top end to it that's not too bright, not too sizzly. Also, these JZ Vintage Series microphones, the V67 and the V11, are awesome sounding mics, and the Black Hole, the BH1S, just have a really, really great transient response for the top end, so that you don't have to add an EQ, to it. You don't feel the need to sort of brighten a mic at all. They're just very crisp because the detail is already picked up, sort of not lost. And then sometimes just an SM57 is the great choice for an acoustic. And doing a two mic trick is a really cool way. You can put two mics side by side, pointed at, wherever you want to point them on the guitar. Do a large diaphragm and a small diaphragm. So maybe like my Mic Tech C5 and the U67 together, or the Mic Tech and, the Roswell Delphos side by side. And then you can blend those two to choose which kind of guitar tone you want, depending on what part you're playing. So that's kind of a cool way to cover your bases too when you're recording the acoustic, and have a little more of a choice at mix.
What do you have kind of go-to positions for mics usually?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of the 12th fret area is a pretty good go-to for acoustic. When I'm recording myself, I like to put the mic out there, and then I just move around until I love the sound of it in my headphones, and that's what I go with. And that can vary a little bit. But I remember, way back when I was recording a record called Home Away for Will Kimbrough, and we were just struggling to figure out how to record the acoustic so that it would sit in the track just right. I ended up taking my Octava MK12, and I came over his right shoulder above the guitar, pointing down. And that was like perfect. It was perfect. And he was doing this whole finger picking guitar thing, and it had everything I wanted and none of the bad stuff. So, the real takeaway is don't be afraid to try a lot of different things and move it around. And the easiest way to find that mic position, if you're just the engineer by yourself, is go out there with headphones, move the mic around into different spots until you hear something you love, and then put it on a stand right there and just try everywhere you can think of. Don't. And if you have an assistant moving it around, that's really helpful. But then it's really hard to communicate about where you liked it the best. And so one solution to that possibly is actually set up an iPhone to record the video of him moving the mic in all the different spots and record that to a track at the same time. And then why not, import that video into the session if you can figure out how to line it up. That may or may not be tricky to do. It's probably not too hard to do. And then watch the video, and when you hit that spot where you're like, "Ooh, that was where it sounded the best," then you have a picture of where the person was holding the mic.
Great. So maybe moving on to vocal mics. Maybe you start with when someone is playing an acoustic guitar. Do you have kind of standard vocal mics?
I do different things. If somebody's playing acoustic and singing, and I can get away with it, I'll love to have a large diaphragm condenser on their voice. The Neumann U67 sounds amazing. I have a Lewitt LCT 940 that can sound really amazing. My Roswell Delphos is really one of my favorite vocal mics right now. In fact, for my record, I did a shootout of 20 microphones in the studio because I could, and I ended up choosing the Delphos as my go-to vocal mic for my record, doing 5-song thing. And then, sometimes dynamics can be really cool. The great thing about a dynamic mic is it's going to do a better job of rejecting the other sounds that are going on. So if somebody's really banging on an acoustic guitar below, an SM7 could be the perfect choice.
Are the mics that you'd use for kind of overdubbed vocals or solo vocals pretty similar then?
Yeah, they're similar. Go-to mics is probably a long list for me, but that Roswell Delphos, the Roswell Colaris is another choice. The Mic Tech CV3, the Lewitt LCT 940, my Neumann U67, the Mic Tech CV3 is a really good. Oh, maybe I already said that one. Yeah, the AKG 414 BULS, that's a really good choice because of the darkness on top. Sometimes that lets a voice open up and not be harsh and sound strident. My U67 is a beautiful sounding mic, but on certain voices, when they start to push it, I call it strident. It's just like the mid-range is too aggressive, And so a mic like the AKG 414 can solve that. Of course, all the dynamic mics, totally worth trying an SM58, an SM57, an SM7, or any of the other dynamics that I've got here, like the RE16 and RE10. The Coles 4038 sometimes can be a good choice for a vocal mic, but it's got a huge proximity effect. So that's sort of more of a rare occasion, and you really have to get your gain structure dialed in just right, and the mic sort of backed away, but in the ideal spot. So, there's a lot of choices, and you really have to experiment to see which one you like the best.
I think the last kind of main instrument we haven't talked about is piano. Do you have favorite mic techniques for piano, upright or grand?
Yeah, so I have a 7-foot Steinway from 1920 here, which means that I'm recording a lot of piano, and it's a beautiful instrument, so therefore it attracts people who want to record piano. And it's like the more that person wants to record that piano, probably the bigger the pressure is on me to get the just right piano sound for them. But stuff I've learned is that if you're trying to do a big, wide open piano sound that is a featured instrument to accompany a voice or maybe a jazz thing, then you probably want to go, try out your large diaphragm condenser mics, different ways to approach it. A pair of those inside. Sometimes I'll open the piano lid all the way up because you could remove it if you know how to, there's little clips that will let you remove it if you got enough people. Or in my space, I can actually lean it up and over, and then just lean it against the wall. So the piano is actually like wide open, makes it a little easier to get the mics there. And a pair of large diaphragm condensers above the hammers facing down will just give you more detail of the attack of the hammers on those notes. So if you're building a track where the piano needs to, the hammer attack needs to come through the rest of the band you're recording with, then that could be a good choice. If you want something that sounds a little bit more natural and open, then a great technique I learned is take the 2 large diaphragm condensers, and you don't even have to, the lid can just be open with the stick in the largest open, full stick, I think is what they call it. And then you just take one of those condensers, and so let's say you're standing in the little cutaway of the piano, and the pianist is over to your left. You take one of the condensers with your left hand and you set it to where it's looking down kind of over the V in the metal harp there. So it's basically seeing the soundboard just below the hammers in that middle C, upper, the mid-range section of the piano. And then the other mic can be looking either from the bottom of the low strings, looking up those strings, and both mics are about the similar height. So it's not like one's lower and closer to the soundboard than the other. It's just more position. But it could be looking up those strings, and that can sound really great. Or it can be more like the mic on your left. It's just sort of on the right, looking over the soundboard toward the low strings. And that'll give you more of a natural open sound. And then a great trick I learned from live sound engineers for Claire Brothers sounds, Claire Brothers live sound production. They talked about a way to mic up a grand on a stage so you can get a really sort of focused in your face sound. And they take a 57 and they put it in the third sound hole of a grand, and you just put it right in the sound hole. So it's like flush with the metal opening of the sound hole. And that gives you a cool sound. It's not hi-fi necessarily, but it rejects a lot of other things, and it gives you, a full frequency, just a full range of the whole piano. And that can sound awesome. So there's probably more than that, but those are some good starting ones. And I guess, you might try some small diaphragm mics up around the hammers if you really don't want a full piano sound, but you just want to get the attack of the piano, because it's those hammers that are going to make the piano cut through a track. If you've got guitars and bass and drums and vocals and organs and all kinds of stuff going on.
You generally fussy about mic preamps?
Yeah, I like to use the ones that we've got and that work.
Right.
I mean, so that's the thing. Most of the time when you're in the studio, you're going to have limited options on mic pre's, so you're really just trying to use the right ones for the right job. The mic pre's that are built into my mixing console here, it's a custom-built MCI board for the 1970s, and those mic pre's sound great. They sound particularly great on a 57 on a guitar amp. In fact, this is the same console that recorded Hotel California for the Eagles. So all those iconic classic Joe Walsh guitar riffs in Hotel California were all recorded through these mic pre's. That sort of makes me feel good when I'm recording guitar. But I also have a Calrec rack. It's got 6 mic pre's in it, and those all have EQs. So they become the go-tos for my inside kick mic and my snare top mic, where I know that I need to do a little bit of EQing when I actually record it. Vocal mics, I rarely to never do any EQ on when I'm recording it. If it doesn't sound right, it means that I'm not, either we're not positioning the mic right, or it's not the right mic choice, or the singer's, voice isn't cutting through. We need to change up things, or the compression's not right. If I'm EQing a voice, it's usually more to go for, at the recording stage, it's usually more with the intent of trying to get an effect out of it than to try and correct for it not sounding right,
What does your 2-bus normally look like?
Well, I just finished mixing a jazz album for David Rogers, and I've recently arrived at a 2-bus setup that I really enjoy. I'll probably put, and this is all mixing inside the box, but I'll probably route everything so that it goes first through, whoops, sorry about that. Something fell off the table. I'll probably route everything first so that it goes through a 2-mix, first through an EQ, which could allow me to just carve off, shave off 20 hertz, 30 hertz and below, whatever I'm like afraid is coming through and messing with my final mix bus settings. Or maybe if I want to do a little bit of a smiley face EQ, I know some people really love using, a pair of Pultecs with a little bit of low end boost, a little bit of high end boost. I've been recently actually mixing through the Andrew Shepp's omni-channel as well, and sort of doing a little bit of stereo bus compression with that, and maybe a little bit of EQ. But regardless of that, let's just say you start with some sort of EQ that lets you shave off the lows in your final mix and keep things controlled. I like to go through a tape plugin if I can, and at least check that out. So a lot of times I'll use the Slate virtual tape simulator. I actually forget what it's called right now, but it's the one. It's the Slate tape thing. Yeah. And then I'll go from there through a compressor, and again the Slate virtual compressor rack, which I'll maybe experiment with some of the different ones. They've got the SSL style, they've got the Focusrite style, and then they've got the Fairchild version, and I'll just try all of those and see which one seems best. For me, the Fairchild, the Fairchild emulator, basically built into it adds more top end and more excitement, harmonic excitement. So if I'm wanting that added to my track, then I'll try, I might use that one. But if I'm recording a rock thing that's going to potentially be kind of need to be careful about the high end, and we want to make sure it's darker might be a little bit better, then the SSL style is great for that. And then what I do from there now is I split it. So I split that mix bus. That'll just be called mix bus. And then I route that to 2 more aux tracks. One of them is called cold mix, and one of them is called hot mix. Cold mix will just go straight from there to output 1 and 2. And then hot mix will go straight from hot mix to output 3 and 4. And then that way I can flip between my 2 mix buttons on my volume knob, and I can listen to the mix that doesn't have any added additional limiting gain after that. But the hot mix it's like a free for all. I can do whatever I want. I can put, 2, 3 different limiter plugins on it and really try and boost that gain up and basically kind of emulate mastering and get it as hot as I think I'm going to want it to be to send it in a final email for a reference listen. Because if you send a mix out, to yourself or to a client and it's quiet, but you try and go listen to it on your iPhone or in the car, I know there's a lot of talk about, just turn the volume up. But the truth is, in my experience, there's only so much turning up the volume you can do before it just sounds shitty. Like there really is a sweet spot for consumer gear listen playback. And so I like to try and make sure that I'm printing a hot mix that allows me to hear it in that context. And a lot of times I'll actually mix, while I'm mixing, I'll listen to the hot mix. And what that does too is it gives you a chance to, if your instinct is to make things sound exciting, it gives you a chance to make it exciting to yourself and you hear it. And it's safe to run the risk of pushing your mix too hard because there's always this other one that doesn't have all that extra stuff added to it. And you can always use that one at mastering, or you can just go back to that one and reboost it from there. And sure enough, when we went to master with Ryan Smith, that the mixes that he chose were my cold mixes, and he rebuilt the master from that, and it sounds fantastic, So that's been a really helpful trick for me. And then I'm trying to think about where I put that. So then the cold bus and the hot bus the outputs are routed to 2 places. So the cold bus is routed to output 1 and 2, but it's also routed to output 5 and 6 in Pro Tools. The hot bus is routed to 3 and 4, but it's also routed to 7 and 8 of Pro Tools. That way, when I actually go do the bounce, I can listen to 1 and 2 or 3 and 4 while I'm working, and I can even put on the SonarWorks Reference 4 plugin to actually accommodate for my speaker EQ and sort of make my listening experience, hopefully more accurate to what I need it to be, and so that it sounds good when I leave the studio. But when I go do the Pro Tools bounce, because I'm in the habit of bouncing from Pro Tools, I don't do the print back into Pro Tools like some people do. Then when I do a bounce, I actually can just bounce 5, 6, 7, and 8. And select the MP3 option, and in a single offline bounce, I'm getting my cold print as a high-res WAV file, I'm getting my hot print as a high-res WAV file, and I'm getting my MP3 version all at once. And then I can just send the MP3 to myself for listen in email. So hopefully that's not too much information all at once.
No, that's great.
That's my more recent version. That's what I'm excited about. And then the one last thing that's so crucial is whether you're listening to your cold output or your hot output, make sure you have some sort of a reference option there that lets you check your reference against other things and keep resetting your bearings. So I use the mastering the mix reference plugin, and that one has been just a total lifesaver. It's so useful. It's so easy to flip between one mix and another. If I'm listening to some other hit song and that's my reference, or more realistically and more often, I'm just trying to listen to the last week's mix we did and make sure that these changes I'm doing now to improve it are actually improving over the last mix. So you can actually load in your previous mix and then hear the mix you're working on right now, and with a flip of a button, flip between those two. And again, that can live on output stage 1 and 2 and output stage 3 and 4. But remember, I'm printing 5, 6, and 7, and 8, so I'm not even at risk of going through that plugin when I actually print.
Great. I think that's all my questions. So thanks a lot for
Good,
coming on the
man.
podcast.
That's all my answers.
Great. Yeah, and anyone who isn't familiar, and I'm sure everyone is if they listen to recording podcasts, but Lij does a great podcast called Recording Studio Rockstars with basically all the same guests as me and a lot more.
And even Hamish. Hamish is a guest coming up.
Guest, yeah.
Maybe out by the time this comes out. But I wanted to share a few things just for places for your listeners to go check out if they're interested in the stuff we talked about. The first topic was my home studio battle. If you're curious at all about that, please go to savehomestudios.com, and I've got a website where I'm just kind of collecting all the links. It's not very elegant right now, but you can get the basic gist of it, and there's a lot of links you can click through to go read other articles that have been written about it and pick up on the story. Or you could also get yourself a t-shirt if you want, because we made some fun t-shirts that say, they just got like a fist and a microphone. They say Save Home Studios. And then if you're curious about my studio here in East Nashville, that is thetoyboxstudio.com. You can just click through there, learn more about this place. And then also you click through that. There's a link for stereo sessions where you can go see some of those live band performances. And then recordingstudiorockstars.com is where you go to listen to the podcast.
Great. Well, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you, man. It's great to hang out with you, and thanks for hearing me out. It's probably one of your longer interviews.